This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, myself and my colleague, John Drabinski, are going to have an end-of-year recap reflection on the first year of the Black Studies Podcast. So, John, how are you doing today?
I'm great. It's end of the semester. I'm in that magical period between not teaching and none of my grading has come in. So I try to sort of act like I'm free of all professional obligations. But yeah, I'm really excited. It's been a pretty phenomenal year of podcasts. We've got it up and running, started with podcast 1, and this is the 70th in the series. So really happy we have a chance to talk today, and really interested. We talk regularly, but it's great to have a chance to actually sit and think together about what this first 70 has meant. So how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Very excited for next Friday, when hopefully all of my grades will be done and turned in, and I can go on a little break before the winter term starts. So
yes, hopefully. Me too.
So, just 70 episodes. That's a lot. I don't know that I realized that until you said it right before we hopped on, that this was episode 70. I'm really thankful for all of the different guests that we have been able to have, and the conversations that have happened, and all of the insight that has come. Like, that's to do 70 episodes in essentially a semester has been a whirlwind, but it's been amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. 70 is a lot. I was surprised too. I looked at the number and I was like, number 70. Yeah. Cause this will be out. I mean, it's Wednesday. It'll be out a week from tomorrow. And that's real soon. So
yeah. So given that we are now at episode 70, how has the podcast been what you expected, or how has it been different than you expected?
Yeah. I think when we were putting this together and talking about it, one of the things I thought about, and I'd previously had a podcast which is coming off hiatus in the new year also, with Fatima Sek, who's a graduate student in comparative literature at University of Maryland, New Books podcast. And one of the things I really love about that New Books podcast is that it's conversation. It's talking about books. And so I was really excited to start this series because the thing we both really care so much about is the field of Black studies, and the chance to just be in relation to the field in conversation mode. That was what I expected. Like, I really wanted that from the series, because I didn't get into academia, just for the vanity of publications. I definitely connect very deeply to the mission of education and think of myself as primarily an educator, and that gives me plenty of value. But really deep down, I think what I wanted out of my professional life was conversation. And so my sort of expectation from the series was that I would be able to engage in those conversations. And they've just been like super gratifying to me. And, so that in terms of like what it's been that I expected was that. And strangely, what is unexpected for me, and I don't know why, and I've been really reflecting on this, what was unexpected for me is just how wildly diverse the stories of people getting into Black studies is, what the meaning of Black studies is for their research and teaching, how it impacts their research and their sense of the world and their sense of their own being as cultural and political actors. I didn't expect uniformity, but every conversation I'm like, that's pretty interesting. Like, I had not really seen the field or seen a way of getting into this kind of study and conversation and thought from so many different perspectives. And that's just been like this amazing surprise for me. And it's been more of a surprise than I think I would have thought, because I was like, oh, of course, people have different ways in. But I'm like, no, people tell really, really different stories. And when I say like conversation is why I got into this, I'm like, that's the conversations I like having because it's about
Mhm.
big ideas and big political stakes and global history. But it's also this very intimate thing about, what moves me through the world and how do I negotiate it? And how does it connect to that global history, to these big ideas? So I guess, that for me has been the unexpected thing that, doing 70 basically in a semester is a lot of work, but it's so much pleasure because I just love that unexpected. And I've come to really anticipate it. Like, what is this person going to say? How
Mhm.
are they going to narrate their way into and conceive the field? So, but what about you? What has it been that you expected and unexpected?
So, unexpectedly, I've really enjoyed it. We've talked about this before, but when you brought up the idea to do a podcast, I thought it was a great idea, but I was also very hesitant to have these conversations and to reach out to these scholars and to hear myself talking, right? But
That
it
part's
is,
always weird. Yeah.
and I think that I've spent so being a lecturer and primarily working on teaching, right? I haven't had as much time, particularly since COVID, to be engaged in the research and the reading and the writing in ways that I have in the past. And so for me, one of the unexpected things has been just a regrounding in the field itself. And I think that the conversations, the ways that different people have talked about Black studies, their relationship to the field, their commitment to the field, and what the field is, has really allowed me to reflect on my own relationship to the field and to think
Mm,
back to like why I got my degree in Black studies, like why that was important to me and what that means for the type of work that I want to do moving forward and the type of teaching that I want to do moving forward. It has been so affirming to be able to talk to so many amazing scholars and artists and organizers and different people who are doing this work in different ways. And I think that the trajectory of my academic career always felt like it was all over the place to me, like going from international and public affairs to sociology of education to Black studies in urban education. Like I always felt a little bit all over the place, but the conversations have really helped me to feel more like, nah, that's just Black studies.
mm,
Right. And so,
yeah.
like, I knew I had the degree in Black studies, but now the trajectory makes more sense in my mind than it used to,
Mhm.
in terms of how that allowed me to see the different methodologies for answering the questions. And keeping the questions at the center makes everything else come together and make sense. And that's something that I didn't anticipate. I also I'm just so thankful for the generosity in the responses and in the openness and willingness of so many to be a part of the project.
Yep.
I know everyone's super busy, there's so much going on right now, and then it's just an interesting time socially, politically, and economically, but people have been willing to have these conversations, and I'm really blown away and thankful for that.
Yeah, I mean the generosity of people. I'm glad you put it that way. I've really loved that, and maybe that was a little bit unexpected. I tend to think, that not tend to think, but so many of our professional relationships have a transactional dimension to them
Mhm.
of, and sometimes in very positive ways, in the sense of like I talk to, person A about a book project and they talk to person C and then I bring my proposal, so we do a lot of that transacting. And I think and I would have been fine if it had ended up being, people were like, okay, this is a sort of a professional obligation. Let me get my voice on the record. But when you use that word generosity, I mean, I think that's such an important way to put it because people haven't. I can't think of a single conversation I've had where I thought people were just putting in time. People
No. Yeah.
clearly like let's talk about the field. Let me speculate. Let me be troubled by this question, and let me be a little perplexed. Let me be speculative. All those generosity things.
Yeah. And I mean, like, for me personally, just even some of the people that we've had on and contacting them, like, coming from Black studies, this is my bibliography, right? And so that aspect of it, like being able to actually be in
Yeah.
conversation with the people that I've been citing for the past 10 years has been amazing. It's been phenomenal. And yeah, it's just been amazing. And I'm very thankful for that opportunity, especially because for many of the people that we've been able to be in conversation with, I don't know where that would have happened otherwise. Like, this is a very particular space to allow for that in a way that even like attendance at conferences doesn't necessarily facilitate. Like, you go to conferences, yeah, you're talking to people, but you're also attending panels and presenting, and everything can be so segmented. But having these one-on-one conversations with people who you might not have otherwise been able to cross paths with has been really, really fulfilling.
And that thing that you know, and I agree, I totally agree, of course. You know, at conferences, we sit down and talk, but then we get interrupted because everybody sees their other friends. And, you know, the idea that you would sit for 45 to like 75 minutes and just talk about, like, what do you think about Black studies? Let me listen to you. Let me have like my comments, but let me listen to you and take in what you say and let others do that too. It is really unique. That's another unexpected thing. I think in some ways for me, I didn't really understand what we were doing. I was like, well, Fatima and I did this new books podcast. I think like one on the past and future of Black studies would be interesting, but I hadn't thought of exactly what you were saying. That's been an unexpected thing for me. Like, oh, we're actually doing a thing that we kind of try to do sometimes at conferences and we hope happens at a panel. But of course it can't because, you know, again, 75 minutes sitting together, one person listening to the other. This is not our lives, but the podcast gets to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the point that you said about like learning or hearing about people's introductions and trajectories into the field is also so interesting, because that's not necessarily the kind of thing that's going to come up in somebody's article or in somebody's book. And those stories are so interesting because they're so varied, right? Like, everybody is coming to Black studies in different ways from different perspectives. They're tracking what drew them to the field from different points. And it's just, it's a good reminder that like this journey looks different for everyone and there are multiple ways to get here, but also like we all got here.
Yeah, I was thinking back on some of the narratives in, and you know, recent one that you did with Gerald Horne, where he's basically, his origin story is he had to sell newspapers at age 9 and he hated labor, child labor, sort of his politicization, but he also sat and read the papers, which is the other part of his work, which is reading. You know, I was like, this is like amazingly, both is very specific, but it's also very early, very young, but also you just see like, all of a sudden for me, like having read so many of his books, I'd like to say I've read all of them, but if he would slow down, I could read all of them. But all of a sudden the book's just like, oh, this is all coheres with like little 9-year-old, you know, Professor Horne. And then sometimes it's people, you know, I think of like Mark Anthony Neal talking about like going to poetry readings, and like Amiri Baraka would spread out these sort of stapled collections of his poetry and you would buy them and you'd pass them around. Or, you know, the way mixtapes, you know, got people thinking differently about Black history or a class or a parent's bookshelf. And like you said, we all got here. And so that's what's also so interesting is it's the story, but it's that the story all ends up in the same place. It's pretty phenomenal. And also, you know, when you said that thing about bibliographies, I was also struck by, when you said that, I thought that's been an interesting thing for me too. I think was also unexpected was those conversations with people, both that I was a part of it and listening to ones that you had, of people from my bibliography, and thinking this field has been in really good hands for a long time. And as I have a lot of gratitude, even people who are just slightly older than me, but have been in the field longer, because I've really started in the field around 2001, 2002. People have been in it since the 90s or 80s. But then I also had, you know, conversations with grad students and brand new professors, and thinking that it's like the two ends of that. It's been in great hands and it's in really good hands. Like I find myself worrying about the field after the first 70 conversations, worrying about the field in terms of the government banning the study.
Mhm.
That's a real issue. You and I have talked about this. I don't think we're being paranoid at all. And then funding by and support by universities and
Yeah.
colleges. That's always so anarchical, you don't know. But in terms of actual content, I also I have like no worries, because the young people, new in the profession, people we've talked to, it's in really good hands that way. I hadn't expected to have that feeling of, we have security where it matters.
Mhm.
Now that other part that matters about being allowed to do what we do and being funded, that's my worry, rather than do we have the heft intellectually and ethically and politically in the field.
Yeah, I agree. The work is being done. Whether the work is going to continue to be funded is an entirely other question. But the work will continue. It was there before the institutionalization of the field. And if that institutionalization goes away, the work will still continue in very real and important ways. And I do think that the conversations have been a really great reminder of that, and a really affirming practice.
Yeah, I think also that what you're talking about, one thing that has been in my mind ever since I had the conversation with him, was the conversation with Jay Carter, where he says, Black studies, like as we know it as an institution on campuses, as books and article publication. He says it's not, Black studies didn't make Black studies. What Black studies did was bring something like the church reading group to a campus, to a classroom, to an article, to a book. And there have been other people who have sort of reminded me in important ways that whatever crises we have on campuses, Black study happens. And that's something we have to remember, because that may be our refuge as people who care about Black study itself. And whatever is happening in the field, there is that relationship to what came before.
Yeah.
And what continues alongside, we are part of an extension, like it's the sense of like a lengthening out of cultural and social space. Yeah, I've really liked that part of podcast stuff. But thinking about like that, what Black studies is, I'm curious what sort of portraits you've seen emerge, whether a trend or just something that's caught your curiosity, or different portraits that have stuck out for you.
I think the thing that resonates with me the most, that has been said by several of the amazing people who have been on the podcast, is that it's about the questions, right? And so you can describe Black studies in a number of different ways, and there have definitely been scholars who have defined it, right? But when it comes down to the practicality or the actual work, it's about the questions that you're asking. And it's about asking questions that are rooted in Black communities and Black ways of knowing. And understanding that then the question is driving the methods, and not the methods driving the question. Not being constrained to a particular set of methods to answer that question, but asking a question and then tackling it the best way for that particular question in that particular moment, knowing that in 20 years or in 5 years, this question can be re-asked and answered using different methods and different knowledge in different ways, but staying rooted in Black ways of knowing. I think it has opened my mind to all of the possibilities that exist in Black studies, the expansiveness of the field in a way that I don't think I had seriously sat down and thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very similar portrait, or aspects of this portrait of Black studies that has really struck me across the podcast. I hadn't quite put it in terms of the, previously, and really until you said it, I hadn't sort of crystallized it that way. But this idea that the question matters, and the kinds of knowing that are going to be the source of the answer.
Mm-hmm.
And then the methods come to that. The thing that really strikes me about that is how, if somebody says, well, Black studies is an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary field, and I say, yes, of course it is, the immediate question that people have is, well, how can you just mix disciplines? Or is interdisciplinary really a real thing? Which starts with this idea of Black studies as a space where disciplines come and mix. But the way you just described it there is not that order of process at all. The order of process that gets you to a characterization as multi or interdisciplinary is there's just a question and a way of knowing that's going to give us an answer to the question. Now, what sort of disciplinary methods can be modified in order to adapt to both the question and the source point or source material of the answer? That, to me, I have to say I had not put it that way, and I've struggled with those words like interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and even in a lot of my podcasts, people will say like anti-disciplinary.
Yeah.
But really centering this notion of we need to reckon with what does it mean to have disciplinary forces in the field of Black studies. I love the way you talked about it there and the way that people have talked about it in the podcast when they put that question and sources of knowing that would answer the question and letting the methods and disciplinary insights come later. I think that in academia, that's a really hard way for people to get started. I think, people don't start with, a question and a source of knowing. I think creative writers do. They're like, I want this character to do this thing and he belongs to this sort of identity. And now how can I gather materials to make that happen? But in terms of scholarly fields, I just don't think people start with questions and source points, source material. And that has to be so expansive, right? As you say, like Black ways of knowing. And not to go on and on in response to that, but, this is not on the podcast, but I remember where I saw that for the first time it was just a Facebook post by Mark Anthony Neal, who's been a friend of mine for a while. And it was right after the Grammy Award for Best Hip Hop Album went to Macklemore and not Kendrick Lamar. And people were outraged or defensive, just as these things go. Just historically, if you look back at that, how bad does that choice look, right? And that's nothing about Macklemore, right? People like his music, but the idea that that would have been the decision. But I remember Mark posting about that, like in the midst of all the social media fury about it and debate, and he just said, "We," meaning African Americans. He was like, "We have our own standards, and we're not beholden to this."
Yeah.
And it was at that point, I was a Black studies professor at the time, that crystallized for me, what you were just talking about. Is this like, well, what does it mean to just have a different standard and say, we're going to operate according to this? We're not going to operate according to a different standard. We're not going to say, like, would the sociologists approve of this claim?
Yeah.
We're going to say, does it adhere to Black ways of knowing and traditions? Or does it break inside those traditions and ways of knowing to open up something new? That's just so different.
It is. And I think that is hard to maintain within institutions. I think that,
absolutely.
Being in institutions mean that having your own standards, those standards are not always recognized or accepted by the broader structure. And so I think that there's a lot of pressure on scholars who do Black work and consider themselves to be Black studies scholars, to adhere to some more of the traditional disciplinary boundaries or methods or ways of knowing, and to not have as much creativity in how they approach things because it isn't necessarily as legible to specific colleges that are organized around traditional disciplines. Like when you have like a College of Arts and Letters or a College of Social Sciences or a College of Humanities, right? Like there are certain pressures that might come from the top down on how you are approaching those questions and what it means for your own personal trajectory. And I think that's a hard thing, which is also why I think that description of Black studies is so important, and just a great reminder that, like, one, Black studies exists outside the bounds of the university. So it's not something that is only within these ivory towers. But it's also, what is your commitment to a different set of standards? And how do you navigate that within this other set of standards that has a real impact on you individually and on departments and departmental status and all of those things too?
I mean, look, to what you're saying, I've been on when I start counting them up, just an obscene number of hiring committees so in my career. It's my least favorite work, but it's really important. But every time in the midst of debating candidates, the question will emerge. It always strikes me as a question that emerges from people who are either negotiating or maybe not fully committed to the field of Black studies, if I can just be blunt, where they say, like, well, will this person be able to get tenure in at Amherst College, right, where I was before, or now in a college of social science? And that's a legitimate question because this is somebody's paycheck and career, and we shouldn't fuck around with that. Like, we can all agree with that, hopefully. But, my response is always, and I try to craft it because I think the bluntness of saying it is often not socially helpful, but it's hard to not say, because I always just want to say, like, this is a Black studies scholar. If we can't fight for their tenure, what are we doing in this department? I mean, we're wasting resources and actively harming the field. If we can't say this person comes with a Black studies approach, with a question, a sense of Black source materials, finding methods to answer their question, to completely thieve your characterization there. If they're doing that, it means that they fit here. They're doing what the field does best when it's at its best. But if we can't make sure, as advocates, as people who make arguments in cases, if we can't make space and arguments and militate against any hegemony from a college that tries to diminish that scholarship, like, what are we doing? It's that what are we doing point. I just think that's not helpful in a social situation, but I feel that because I'm like what? They do Black Studies scholarship or a Black Studies department. Of course, we'll do everything we can if they're a tenurable case, right? If they're a promotable case. But that's where I think what I've loved about this podcast is I feel like people who are struggling to explain what Black studies is to people, or even to resolve it for themselves, because I think it's fine for what is Black studies to be a primary question of Black studies.
Yeah.
I like that. But there is an action point. How do you hire and get somebody promoted and tenured? But I think this podcast has really given people, like, that question, like, what portrait is come out of these conversations. I think it's given some portraitures that you can just take and, like, put in front of a dean and say, look at this. This is what we do. This person does that. That's a tenurable case. That's a book series that should exist. That's a book that should be published. That's a classroom that is legitimate and should be defended if under fire.
I agree. I mean, coming from the non-tenure track side, right? Like, teaching is something that I'm very, it's actually why I went into the academy, like, because of my teacher, and then because I wanted to do what he did, what Austin Jackson did in my first year writing class. And so the teaching side of it, I think what Black studies classrooms look like has also been a really big thing for me. One, because the nature of my job as Doug's means I'm very much intimately connected to the curriculum of the department and what is being taught, but also I just like teaching in the classroom, and that's always fascinated me. So the different ways that people approach Black studies classrooms, how they envision and create and innovate, has been a phenomenal learning experience and just so enlightening. And thinking about the importance of teaching to the field of Black studies, like, it's something that always resonated with me. But I know that in research-heavy spaces, at R1s, in tenure track positions, that's not necessarily what's emphasized. But the commitment and the innovation that so many have in their classrooms, even though that's not necessarily the thing that's going to be weighted the most, or the ways in which the teaching is informing the research and the research is informing the teaching, has been also very interesting and enlightening in all of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a tenured professor and on that side of things, but I feel like when people are in a Black studies department and they don't care about the mission of education, first of all, I just never understand that. I'm like, isn't that what I mean, there is no university without students and professors. Everything else is a support system for that, whether it's dorms or campus counseling center or sabbatical or research support or, offices, staff. So, there's that. I'm like, get it together. This is why we're here. There's the personal dimension, as you said. I mean, I'm like you. I mean, at one point, Professor Patrick Burke said to me, "You're pretty good at this. You should think about, doing it for a living." And I went from thinking, that I didn't have a life that was really very worth very much, and I didn't really have any talents or capacities, but I just kind of liked doing this thing called school, to all of a sudden being a totally different person. And I'm like, this is education's magical, right?
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It can be a grind. I mean, whatever, everything's a grind at some level too. But when people don't have that connection to classrooms in Black studies, just what you were saying, I just feel like they miss something really magical, and the ability to learn from each other in really interesting ways. I think when I was in philosophy departments at the very, very beginning of my career, because that was my PhD before I reinvented myself, what I would get from my colleagues in terms of teaching would be something like, start your first day of class with an open conversation. So they think this is where you come to have a conversation, not for a lecture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be like technique tips. I love those. I've taken so many of those on over my career. But I think in the Black studies context, like what can happen in a classroom means that you get totally different things. I had one of the podcasts with Stephanie Sparling Williams, who's a curator, but has an American studies and Black studies educational background, doctoral education. She used this phrase, I think she got it from Hartman, this idea of breathing Black air. She says, that's what I want from curatorial work. I want people to walk through this and breathe Black air. Now that to me was hugely impactful about my Black studies classroom.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I went in and like 24 hours later, I was like, in my Angela Davis seminar, I was like, one of the things I hope you feel in this class, not just learning ideas and politics and somebody's intellectual journey, but also like breathing like this Black feminist air, breathing this radical Black politics air through our reading and conversations. And so that sense of like, even just a phrase, there's also all kinds of texts like the song or this lyric or this sound and, and a jazz piece, whatever. There's so many things, but even just like a turn of phrase. And my students kept talking about that. I mean, I emailed Stephanie and I was like, that phrase that took off and like wildfire in my class, because they were like, yes, when I read, I breathe air. But I didn't get those same tips when I was in philosophy. And I think it speaks to that difference of the Black studies classroom, that if you care about it and cultivate it, think about it like a garden that you cultivate. Sometimes it's something that refreshes the topsoil, right? That lives really well in the nitrogen composition of the earth or something. There are things that work. There are different things that work. It's not really about techniques. It's about atmosphere and sound and visions and art and political moments
And methods. I think that
Absolutely.
came up a lot too, right? Like the different mediums and methods that are brought into the classroom. And I think that was super interesting. Like, yeah, having that conversation with so many about like what they actually do in the classroom and how they see their classroom as different, if at all, from what might happen someplace else was so interesting to me. And like you said, like cultivating that environment and like coming from teaching writing where, to be fair, I came from, so Michigan State RAC program is very well known and influential and very particular about the type of training that they give their writing instructors, which included the graduate TAs, because that was my funding package, was teaching writing and then going to work at Stanford, Empower, and then UCLA's program of writing and Loyola Marymount's rhetorical arts department. Like there's so much emphasis on what the classroom is like in those spaces, that those are the kind of conversations that I've been having for such a long time but not, I wasn't able to have them, or I hadn't had them in Black studies yet. So having those conversations and kind of, again, seeing like, okay, so what methods from teaching writing are helpful for addressing these questions in a Black studies classroom, or addressing the question of what a Black studies classroom looks like, or can look like, or should feel like, have been, yeah, it's made me think so much about not just my own classrooms, but the classrooms in our department, right? Like, what does our curriculum look like? What do our classrooms feel like? And how is that in alignment with the ability of Black studies to take questions and use those questions as a driving force for everything that comes next?
In that place of writing, just to reference another podcast episode, the one that you did with Nathaniel Norman was so interesting that way, and the way he talked about writing. And he has one of the OGs of the field. He was like, writing is not just a skill, it is Black studies practice. I love that. And that I've sat with that, and I have to figure out what that means for me, because I think he's right. And you'd said this too, and it just kind of interpersonally over the past few years. But when in that conversation, it kind of all came together for me, the way you two talked about that, and him talking about the Black Ink Project at Morehouse. I was like, I need to also think about that. So, sort of this last question, how has the podcast shifted or impacted the way you see the field of Black studies? I'm curious to hear you talk about that. That was one thing that did shift for me. I thought, maybe I need to take this question of writing more seriously than I have. And thinking about writing in my classroom, has that been a place where I've been actually quite pedagogically quite conservative about, like, I'm transferring a skill. I do like to work with students on that. I don't think there's anything wrong with transferring skills. I mean, everybody needs to learn how to write better and be organized and how to make arguments and so forth. But it's thinking about writing as a Black studies project. That's the thing that shifted my thinking about the field in a really significant way. That's both makes me look at people I read and teach in certain ways, but more intimately, how I practice Black studies inside my own classroom. And that's unresolved for me. I'm not going to say like I heard it, now I have an action point. But I was like, let me sit with this long term. And long term, I mean, over the break, over the semester, over the year, but over 10 years. I want to really think about that and see how that can be a more potent part of my classroom, because I think I set good atmospheres. I think I select good texts. Students know I care about them. I mentor them. I affirm their different ways of getting into the material and ways of knowing. But that question of writing is a thing I just had not fully brought in front of myself until this podcast. Now, you've been talking about it, so apologies for not hearing it right. But it crystallized, because I think conversation does that. When you listen in, you're like, okay, this exchange made it meaningful in a way that kind of was a tipping point more than anything. It wasn't like the first time I understood, but it was like a tipping point. So I think my understanding of the field, that's been a place that it's really shifted and made me have an unresolved part of my own understanding of what I do. I like that. I like unresolved, because that gives me something to think about and experiment with. But how about you? Is it something about the podcast, about the field of Black studies, you feel like the podcast has shifted or had a particular kind of impact?
So it definitely has had a huge impact on how I think about what a Black studies department is, right? Yeah. So our department recently changed its name, and, we're going through these conversations about potential shifts in courses and learning outcomes and what's being offered. And it's really made me think deeply about what our curriculum means and what transferable skills are being taught, because one, that's the buzzword right now, right? Like, making it relevant, transferable skills. But what does it look like, right? Like, what does it look like to have a department of Black studies, or a department of African American and Africana studies specifically? What should students know when they walk out of here, right? Like, what are the ideas that they should have a firm grasp on? And what does that mean for not just the courses that we offer, but what our classrooms actually look like. So it's caused me to think a lot more deeply about the structural side. And every year, as the Dougs, we do a learning outcome assessments of, the departmental learning outcomes, right? So what does assessment look like in Black Studies? And what does assessment of the assessments look like in Black Studies? And like, what are those? So those like questions that just build on each other in terms of what does the framework for what we do look like in this particular context? Because I don't think it needs to look the same across institutions or locations, which I think is another thing that is really, that the podcast, and particularly the conversation with Dr. Regina Bradley, like the regionalism, right? Like, what is important in this space? What are the Black Studies questions that are being asked in this space? What are the questions we should be asking in this space, in this context, in this time, that of course align with Black ways of knowing and knowledge production and breathing Black air? But what does it look like in this particular location, in this particular time? And how can that be made legible to students as helpful and as important and as necessary in this particular moment as well?
Yeah, I love that. No, that's that regional question. That's hugely important. Yeah, no, Regina's work and that podcast really brought that home. And that's another question that just sort of sits on my desk. I really like that. Well, we should probably wrap up. We both have meetings. That's the other thing. We started off like, oh, grading, I'll be done in a week and a half. But there's also the business of our day.
Lots of meetings.
But I will just say, I'm looking forward to 2025 with this podcast. I know January has some really fabulous people just to start it off. So I'm looking forward to all those episodes and the episodes that come after that. And I just did want to say, since we're recording this on the podcast, I mean, we're friends. I really value that. I value your friendship and love having you as a colleague. I think you hold us to a really high standard as a department and as a people thinking about the field. But in this context, I'm so glad that we did this podcast together. I've really loved it. I've learned a lot working with you on it. And so thank you for that. This has been a great conversation. We should do this more often.
I agree. And thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to work on this with you. I appreciate, being able to work with you in general. Like we get to have conversations about things like this. And then having the podcast drives further conversations about Black Studies in a way that I don't know would have happened if we didn't have, all of these episodes to debrief about and to
I agree.
pull things from and to think more deeply about. So thank you for suggesting the podcast and for working on the grant. Like even the speaker series has been really interesting and insightful. Like this whole project has just been so affirming and rewarding. So I appreciate that.
I could agree with all of that. So yeah. And 2025, new fresh start, but a little holiday break as well.
Yes.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day, Ashley. Take care.
Thanks. You too.
Bye-bye.